The cold wind swept through the cemetery, shaking the branches of the old oak tree that stood like a sentinel in the middle of the graveyard. It was colder than I'd expected. The kind of cold that made the air feel sharp, biting. The 8 of us stood huddled under that tree, looking around at the tombstones, some of them crumbling and leaning, others tall and proud, etched with names that had long since faded into history. It had been Jackson's idea to meet here that night. It was always Jackson's idea. He was the kind of guy who thrived on dares, on pushing the limits. "Let's play Ghost in the Graveyard," he'd said earlier that week, flashing that grin of his that made it impossible to say no. But not just anywhere. "We'll do it in the old cemetery." "Are you sure about that?" I asked. "What, Toby? Are you too scared to play in the cemetery?" Jackson shot back. I just shook my head no. So here we were. Me, my girlfriend Sam, Jackson, Cody, Sarah, Deb, Kara, Miranda, and Jessica, standing in the middle of the oldest graveyard in town. The cemetery stretched for acres, rows and rows of tombstones and mausoleums winding through trees that swayed in the wind. We weren't supposed to be here, of course. Not after dark, at least. But that's exactly what made it exciting. I remember feeling a strange tension in the air even before we started playing. The day had been overcast, and by the time we met up, the last slivers of daylight were gone, replaced by the thick, murky blackness of a cloudy October night. The moon was hidden, and the only light we had came from our flashlights, which flickered as we moved them over the gravestones. "All right, let's get this started," Jackson said, clapping his hands together and tossing his backpack onto the ground next to the oak tree. "Ghost in the Graveyard, cemetery style." We all laughed, though I could tell some of the others were a little on edge. I felt Sam standing close to me, her arm brushing against mine. I gave her a quick smile, hoping to ease whatever nerves she had. The rules were simple enough. One person is it, and they count by the oak tree while everyone else scatters into the cemetery to hide. Once it finds someone, they join in, and together they hunt the rest of the group. Last person hiding wins. Easy. Jackson volunteered to be it first. Of course he did. He covered his eyes and started counting as the rest of us ran into the shadows, trying to find the best hiding spots. Sam and I stuck together, ducking behind a tall mausoleum that was half covered in ivy. The air was still, except for the occasional gust of wind that rustled the leaves on the ground and made the branches overhead creak. It was quiet, eerily quiet. For the first 6 or 7 rounds, it was fun. We darted between gravestones, laughing when we were found and joining the search for the others. The game went on like that for a couple of hours or so, each round a little more intense than the last. The cemetery was huge, after all, and there were plenty of places to hide. But after a while, the excitement started to wear off. The night was growing colder, and we were all starting to feel it. The wind picked up, carrying with it a strange chill that seemed to settle in our bones. When we gathered back under the oak tree, I could tell by the way everyone was looking around that they were starting to feel the same thing I was. That creeping sense of unease. "All right," Jackson said, still grinning, though his breath was visible in the cold air now. "You guys want to make this night really interesting?" Before anyone could respond, he dropped to his knees and unzipped his backpack. A second later, he pulled out something that made my stomach twist, a Ouija board. The second we saw it, the mood shifted. "No way," Sam said immediately, taking a step back. "I'm not touching that." Jackson laughed. "Come on, Sam, it's just a game. Look, it's made by Hasbro. You're telling me you're scared of a toy?" "I'm telling you I'm not messing with that," she replied, crossing her arms. "I don't care who makes it." Jackson shrugged, that grin never leaving his face. "All right, fine. But the rest of us are doing this, right?" Everyone else hesitated for a second, but then Cody sat down next to Jackson, followed by Sarah and Deb. I glanced at Sam, who shook her head, clearly not happy about it, but she didn't say anything else. I sighed and sat down with the others, placing my hands on the planchette. Jackson rubbed his hands together, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "All right," he said, lowering his voice like we were part of some serious ritual. "Is anyone here with us?" At first, nothing happened. We sat there, shivering slightly, the wind tugging at the edges of the board. I felt ridiculous, and I could see the others glancing at each other, waiting for one of us to push the planchette just to get a laugh. But then it moved. It was slow at first, just a slight shift under our fingers, but enough to make me feel a chill run down my spine. I looked at Cody, but he wasn't laughing. His eyes were wide, his breath coming out in short, nervous bursts. The planchette slid across the board, spelling out, "We are here." I felt my mouth go dry. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but Jackson, always the joker, laughed nervously. "All right, who's messing with it?" he asked, though his voice cracked a little. No one said anything. The planchette moved again. ALWAYS. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees in that moment. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, and the old oak above us groaned as its branches swayed. Jackson, to his credit, kept going. "Okay," he said, though his grin had faltered. "How old are you?" The planchette jerked to life again, faster this time, almost like someone, or something, was pulling it. Older than this place. The air around us felt thick, heavier than before. My skin prickled, and I noticed Sam shifting uncomfortably from where she stood, her arms still crossed. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered, pulling her hands away from the board. "Let's stop." But before anyone could move, the planchette slid across the board one last time, spelling out the final message. "We want you." The second it finished, the wind roared through the cemetery, strong enough to knock the board over and send the planchette flying into the darkness. We all jumped up, startled, our breath coming in ragged bursts. Jackson tried to laugh, but it sounded strained. All right, that was weird." "No," Sam said, her voice sharp and filled with fear. "We're done. Let's get out of here." Jackson sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine. No more board." But the air had changed. We all felt it. Something wasn't right, and the game we had started was over. But we weren't ready to leave just yet. "Let's do one more round," Jackson suggested. "No more pairs. Everyone hides alone." I didn't want to do it, and I could tell the others were uneasy too. But no one wanted to be the first to call it quits. So we spread out again, each of us slipping into the darkness of the cemetery. That's when things really started to go wrong. I was it for the round, standing by the oak tree as I counted down from 30. The wind howled in my ears, and the clouds had swallowed the moon completely now, leaving the cemetery in near total darkness. When I finished counting, I flicked on my flashlight and started searching. The cemetery had never felt so big. The gravestones stretched out in every direction, the paths between them disappearing into shadows. I kept my flashlight moving, scanning for any sign of the others. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint but clear, carried on the wind. I stopped, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the gravestones, standing silently in the dark. I heard it again, closer this time. A voice, low and soft, calling my name. "Toby." My blood ran cold. I swung my flashlight around again, heart pounding. But still, nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A tall, dark figure standing between two gravestones, taller than anyone in our group, its shape barely visible in the faint light of the flashlight. I froze, staring at it. But when I turned the light toward it directly, the figure was gone. I stood there for a moment, my breath caught in my throat, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But then I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, heavy footsteps. And before I could react, something shoved me hard from behind. I stumbled forward, falling onto the ground and slamming my shoulder against a gravestone. "Toby?" I looked up, my heart racing, and saw Sam running toward me, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Cody, Sarah, and Deb were close behind, all of them pale and wide-eyed. "We need to stop," Sam said, helping me up. "Now." We huddled together, the wind whipping around us, whispering through the trees. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared. Terrified, actually. And as we stood there, catching our breath, we realized something. Miranda and Jessica hadn't come back. We stood there, huddled close as the wind howled through the cemetery, the cold biting deeper than before. My heart was still racing, my shoulder aching from the fall. Sam kept looking around, her eyes wide with fear. Cody, Sarah, and Deb weren't much better. Pale faces, breaths coming in short bursts, the same fear reflected in each of us. But that's when we realized it. Miranda and Jessica. Where were they? I glanced around, expecting to see them walking toward us, laughing about how good their hiding spots had been. But they weren't there. No footsteps, no voices, just the eerie quiet of the cemetery. "Where's Miranda? Where's Jess?" Cody asked, his voice shaky. "Where is Jackson?" I asked. "They're still hiding," Jackson said, walking out of the darkness, startling us a bit. His grin was long gone now, replaced by fear. "They probably just don't know the game's over." "They would have come out by now," Deb muttered, rubbing her arms like she was trying to fight off the cold. This doesn't feel right." "Let's call them," Sarah suggested, already pulling out her phone. We all did the same, dialing Miranda and Jessica's numbers, hoping they'd answer. But all we got were ringing tones that echoed around us, unanswered, bouncing off the gravestones. The cemetery suddenly felt too big, too dark. "They probably left," Jackson said after a moment, though even he didn't sound convinced. "You know how they are? Maybe they got bored and just went home." "Without saying anything?" Sam shot back, her voice trembling. "No way. That's not like them." We stood there in silence, the wind rustling through the trees, every sound amplified in the stillness. The unease in the air had thickened, weighing down on us like the sky itself was pressing in. I could feel it in my chest, the creeping dread that told me something wasn't right. "We should go look for them," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Split up, check the cemetery. They can't have gone far." Sam grabbed my arm. "Toby, no. Something's wrong. We need to leave." She wasn't wrong. I could feel it too. That gnawing sense that we'd crossed a line we weren't supposed to cross. That whatever was out there, whatever had answered us on that board, wasn't done with us yet. But we couldn't just leave Miranda and Jessica behind. "We'll stay together," I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll find them, and then we'll go." No one argued after that. We formed a tight group, flashlights cutting through the dark as we moved deeper into the cemetery, calling out their names. "Miranda! Jessica!" The wind swallowed our voices, carrying them off into the night. As we walked, I kept my flashlight moving, scanning every row of gravestones, every shadow, every tree. But the further we went, the more that creeping feeling of dread settled over me. The cemetery seemed to stretch on forever, the paths winding between endless rows of graves. The shadows between the tombstones felt thicker now, deeper, like something was watching us from just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that something was moving just beyond the reach of our flashlights. We called their names again and again, but there was no answer. Only the wind, whispering through the trees. "I don't like this," Cody muttered, his voice tight. "They wouldn't just leave. Something's wrong." I was about to agree when Sam grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. "Toby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look." I followed her gaze and saw them, figures, tall and dark, standing between the gravestones, too tall to be anyone in our group. Their shapes were just outlines, barely visible in the dim light, but they were there, watching us. I blinked, and they were gone. "I saw them too," Deb whispered, her voice shaking. "What? What is that?" I didn't have an answer. No one did. "Let's go," Jackson said, his voice cracking. "Let's just go. We'll check in the morning. Maybe they really did leave. We'll figure it out then." We all nodded, the urgency in his voice pushing us to move. We turned back toward the oak tree, hurrying along the path, but the dark seemed to close in on us from all sides. The wind was picking up again, colder, more vicious, and every step felt like we were being watched, followed. When we finally made it back to the oak tree, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, we were all desperate to leave. Miranda and Jessica were nowhere in sight, and the sense of unease had settled into outright fear. We didn't say much as we left the cemetery, walking quickly toward the entrance, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Sam clung to my arm the whole way, her hands ice cold. We didn't talk much after we left the cemetery. We said quick goodbyes and headed home, everyone eager to put the night behind us. Sam and I walked back to her house, and she made me promise to text her when I got home safe. I nodded, kissed her on the forehead, and watched as she disappeared inside. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside my window made me jump. I kept thinking about those dark figures in the cemetery, the way they seemed to watch us, the way they moved just out of sight. And most of all, I couldn't stop thinking about Miranda and Jessica. The next morning, I woke to my phone ringing. It was Sam. "They didn't come home," she said, her voice trembling. "Miranda and Jessica, they're missing." Panic settled in my chest, cold and heavy. Sam explained that she and Kara had called their houses, but neither of the girls had made it back. The parents had already alerted the police, and within hours, search parties were combing the cemetery. I joined them, of course. The whole town did. But the only thing they found were Miranda's and Jessica's phones, lying on the ground between the gravestones, like they'd been dropped and forgotten. For the next week, the town was consumed with the search. Missing posters went up, people knocked on doors, searched the nearby woods, scoured every inch of the cemetery. But there was nothing, no trace of them. It was like they had disappeared into thin air. Halloween came and went that year without the usual excitement. No one let their kids out to trick-or-treat, and the streets were eerily quiet, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for news that never came. 15 years later, there's still no sign of Miranda or Jessica. The town eventually stopped looking, though no one ever really moved on. Not completely. Sam and I broke up at the end of high school, and I moved away for college and never looked back. I still stay in touch with the others through social media. Sam, Cody, Jackson. But we don't talk about that night. We don't talk about the cemetery, or the Ouija board, or the figures we saw. We don't talk about the whispers on the wind or the way the shadows felt alive. Even though we don't ever talk about it, I know that none of us have forgotten. We never will.